Okay. Thank you all for coming. So nice to see you. Good morning. Today, we're going to be talking about, over the span of 2.5 years, the way we work has completely changed. There's no one way to adapt to this reality. So we're going to talk about some of the challenges, the opportunities, and how to try to get this right today. So, Deidre, your company is completely remote, right? And your product actually helps teams manage their workflows. So I'm wondering specifically, what have you seen that actually works?
Yep. I think not only are we mostly remote, our customers, even our large enterprise customers, are mostly remote, right? And the thing that gets important, whether you're 100 people or whether you're 100,000 people, is, does everybody understand where we're going? Like what the strategy is, what part of the strategy we're trying to execute right now, and does everybody understand their part, right, in that, and what their team contributes to that overall outcome? And in the absence of that, what I'll call super fundamental understanding, you have a lot of people remote, but you don't have a lot of people working in the interest or the direction that the company needs to go or travel, right? And I think for a lot of us managing a remote team or organization, it's pretty hard to know, are we actually all headed in the same direction, and are we moving fast? It's actually quite hard to know that if you aren't intentional about a structure and a method and a process, right? You're not intentional about, hey, we all know where we're going, and we all know how we contribute, and we all know how we connect into that. I think that's crucial for companies.
Right.
And it won't happen by accident. It happened by accident when we were at the office.
Yeah.
Right? We just overhear from each other and work together easily. Osmosis worked. It doesn't work when we're on Zoom, and it doesn't work when we're at home.
Right. So one of the things you get right is actually coming together in a remote world.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So, Adriana, we've talked a little bit about this as well, about how to make it intentional. You're currently planning Mural's. You told me backstage, Mural's planning out their own first-time meetup, right? So, what is a good way to? What do you have to think about? Actually, more importantly, it's a lot of money, right? To plan these meetups, to plan this way to get together. We're doing it right now. There's hotels, there's events, there's food. It's a new line item. How do you really convince your CFO that that's a strategic need?
It's really interesting because I would say probably a year ago, it required more convincing of our CEO that it was a strategic need. What we're starting to see 2.5 years into this pandemic and people being much more distributed and being more remote is this disconnected feeling that individuals are getting. So they are actually clamoring to spend more time together. So it wasn't really that difficult. That said, if you are going to be spending all that time, all that money, you're going to bring all these people together, you want to make sure that you're getting the most out of it. And intention is the biggest thing that we're keeping in mind. Try to understand really what is it that you're trying to get and really build an event based on that. You need to orchestrate it, right? You can't just leave it up to chance. I think in the past we used to have these offsites, we would get a bar, we would just hope for the best, and the extroverts would be in a corner making jokes, and then you have the introverts in a corner just feeling lonely, right? So how do you think about creating an environment where everybody's feeling welcome,
right,
where people are actually connecting at a human level, and they're building that social capital so that when you go back to the office and people are a lot more distributed, there is that trust, which is fundamental to all of this distributed work that we're doing.
Well, and what is an example? What's something that you might be planning to implement that you're ensuring that people feel connected to each other and not just, being remote weirdos who are very used to staying at home alone in their pajamas, you know what I mean? So
yeah, there's these little exercises that we actually have tried with smaller groups, but they have been super powerful. And some of you might have heard of some of these, but one of them that I love is this lifeline. And you just kind of go with a group of people, you go through your life and you talk about 4 or 5 events in your life that were very impactful for you as a person and that have made you who you are. And it is really incredible what comes out, and people just get to know each other as human beings, and then you're kind of like, oh, now I understand why you respond the way in which you respond. And it creates this just familiar environment. And we do a ton of little exercises like this. If the team knows each other a little bit better, sometimes we do this feedback session where we go around the room and we give positive feedback, and then we go around and we give constructive feedback. it is incredible how open people are to giving good feedback and also to receiving it. And all of this just builds that trust and that vulnerability. And of course, you just want to have a little fun, right? So maybe you cook a meal together or
cook a meal together. That's actually really fun.
It's really great.
Pizza
to cook
party,
meals
yeah.
together. Mm-hmm.
I like that. So Allison, you've done a lot of remote work in your life. You know, you were doing kind of remote hybrid stuff at Uber as well, I believe you talked about. How do you think that those kinds of meetups and the way that you can connect in real life, how do they translate to when you're back behind, the virtual screen?
Yeah, great question. I think if people are just starting to work together when they're fully remote, work can be very transactional when you're just in front of a computer and having meetings. And I think it can totally change the game when people spend even a small bit of time together. So I think it's really important to plan what these interactions are going to be, and the more that you can communicate to people also in advance what they can expect, because if people are fully remote, you'll get a lot of requests from staff to do these types of meetups, because I think it's something people really crave and are coming back to. And I think it speaks to the success of this conference this year and how many people are coming to see people in person when we've had 3 years of almost all remote work.
Yeah. Now, there are, when you talk about no one's ever met each other. A lot of startups started up during the pandemic. No one's met each other. So aside from meeting up in person, right, we still have to make this work while we're all remote, different parts of the country, of the world. What's a good example of a company culture, like ways that you can develop a company culture remotely? Adriana, you talked a little bit about this.
Yeah, I think part of it is in the past, culture almost happened through osmosis, right? You would have onboarding classes that would be sitting next to people that have been there for a while and then just kind of absorb it from the environment. You maybe were being a little bit more deliberate with if you were opening offices in other locations, right? Where you would actually send a team from the headquarters to open up another office just so they could see that. That is no longer the norm. So going back to this intention, right, is how do you build moments where the culture is exemplified from the moment that you hire the person through every single moment up to offboarding, right? So during the interview phase, how do you understand what your values are, and you're hiring for people that can add to those values, but also identify with them. When you're promoting people, when you're talking about how you made decisions, when you're talking about how you are rewarding individuals. So during our all hands, we do an awards for people who have exemplified our values, and we tell stories, because it is really all about the behaviors that people exemplify, and those stories really help with keeping traditions. Rituals are also really, really important, right? How do you start every meeting or every all hands? These kinds of things are just the ones that bring it alive, the culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, one thing that I often find myself getting concerned about, one of the things about company culture is diversity, equity, inclusion, right? And as a woman, I know what it's like to be talked over in a Zoom meeting, in a meeting when I'm in the room, right? So then when you're completely remote and everyone's on Zoom, it's a lot easier to talk over people. The loudest voices will be heard. And it's also a lot easier to check out. I guess, Deidre, I'm wondering if there's any way that you can kind of ensure that doesn't happen, and if there's any metrics for making sure that everyone's feeling included and their voices are being heard.
Yep. Awesome question. The best thing you can do about it is have a diverse workforce. Right? That's the first job, and it's the hardest job for sure, right? We have and have from the first 5 people had a super diverse and atypical environment for a tech company in particular. And so the people you see on the Zoom, it's very likely that 60% of them are women. Very likely. And it creates a different environment, period. Like the talk over thing when it happens, is so rare that it's all like, whoa, did you see that? That was like a talk over. Well, we don't do that.
Yeah.
Right? And so the norm has shifted. And I think that's powerful, but you have to be intentional, to borrow your word again. When I think about inclusion, though, I think there's 2 things that can make a difference when teams are meeting. And one of those, to me, is actually being clear about what we mean by inclusion. Like, we mean inclusion in the dialogue, we mean ideas are included,
Right.
we mean opportunities to excel are equitably distributed, and we mean opportunities to make an impact are equally distributed. And it's, I think, not enough to say, how do we make sure everybody's ideas get heard? And one way to do that, of course, is use a whiteboard idea where the ideas are first and the conversation follows, right? Like a great meeting right now can start with silence, where our ideas come out first and then we start talking about them, versus the loudest ideas come out and the rest don't, right? That's one way. But I think beyond that is, actually, when you look at, for example, a team's OKRs, who owns the KRs?
Right.
Does Bob own them all?
Yeah. The key
And
results.
the 5 women on the team own none?
Yeah.
Okay, that's not our meeting. That's the way we're managing, right?
So you're actually taking these, like so you actually are saying, like, these are OKRs, objectives, key results. These are, yeah, you're seeing how many come out of each staff, not necessarily to, police them. And are you working hard enough? But
It's a data point.
Are you? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a data point. So if 80% of the KRs across the company are owned by guys and 20% are owned by women, then it's like, you got to ask, do we have 80-20 mix of people? And if we have a 50-50 mix of people, then there's another conversation to be had. And the data is not to go indict anyone. The data is to inform what your culture really is, regardless of what you say it is. And I think all measurement data is actually just signal, like, oh, this is interesting information. Should I change what I do next based on this information, right? And I think that inclusion and opportunity, inclusion and impact is where our heads should be at when we talk about diversity and inclusion, not just, okay, they can come to the company. Well, come to the company to be a spectator is not inclusion. And getting locked out of opportunities to excel and grow and impact and rise up in your career, that's not inclusion.
Right. Yeah. I feel like a lot of the time we can just kind of, a lot of people have said during the pandemic they're so much more productive working from home because no one's bothering them, whatever. People come, they do their work, right? But then that often can lead to, I'm just doing the job, right? Instead of, I'm feeling safe enough to be creative and innovative and test the boundaries. You've worked with a lot of different companies. Are you finding that remote teams are finding it difficult to grow in that way, just because they don't have that human element, a human connection?
In regards to coaching and mentorship, I know we talked about this a little bit on the call, but I think an interesting data point too is what age people are at in their careers. I think in the first, 10 or 15 years of my career, it was all in person, and I have really close relationships with those people years later because we spent so much time together. And I think it's easy to forget the type of learning and osmosis you get from those people just by spending so much time with them, of like people of all levels, and it's really intense work, but you learn a lot through that period. So I think we're gonna have to reinvent how we do a lot of the coaching and mentorship, and making sure that especially people right out of college or younger employees really get the types of opportunities that they need to continue to excel. And yeah, a lot of it is through what Deidre was talking about making sure people own different things and they're able to step up. And part of it too is figuring out how we rethink some of these models in this remote environment where you, as a junior employee, you may not just be able to sit next to a more senior person and just learn a lot by observing how they're working. But with that, I think we're seeing right now that remote work is giving all sorts of new opportunities for people that they didn't have before. I had a baby last year in the middle of the pandemic, and I know a lot of other people did too. And I think the data starting to come out that there was a massive baby boom, and I think I sort of predicted that because all my friends were having babies at the same time. But I think remote work has given people a lot of more time and space to think about things like having families that maybe they previously would have put off longer with commutes every day.
Absolutely. We talked about this actually on the call about how, the world's made for men. There's, public transit's made for, men going to the office, and offices are built around that kind of schedule, and they don't really think about the family life. And but with that, with different time zones, we have asynchronous work realities, but also the fact that we work remotely, people are expecting more work-life balance. They're like, I'll get my work done, but I have to take my kid to school, or I have to do this. So yeah, I guess tech probably helps a lot with managing this, Would you say that, Deidre?
Absolutely, right? If we don't need to meet to figure out where we're going and where we are now,
Yeah.
what that means is I can move forward in my moment and you can move forward in your moment. If we don't have systems that provide us with transparency on direction, action, and progress, then we're going to have a Zoom call to confirm the direction again and see where we are on progress and then decide what actions to take. And which means, right, not only we're going to consume an hour when if we could move forward asynchronously, it would take us all like 5 seconds.
Yeah.
But no, we're going to take an hour instead.
Yeah.
And we all have to be there at the same time in presence. And I think the horrible byproduct of that right now is all of our capacity is 100% dominated by our calendar right now. It's Zoom after Zoom after Zoom after Zoom all day long, every single day. There's nothing meaningful or powerful in that. And it's forcing this, the only way to make one step forward is to call a meeting.
Right. But then it's too many meetings, and then you're just constantly
And
setting
there are
priorities.
no
When
steps
are you
forward.
working?
Exactly. There's only readouts. There's no steps forward, right?
Right.
And I think asynchronous is actually about liberating our time and giving us control back over the one thing we have to give at work, which is time.
Right.
And let us allocate that in the most powerful ways and at our own pace and in our own hours, right? Like, I want to do it at 5 a.m. actually, right? I'm going to make a ton of progress at 5 a.m. where it's super quiet, and if I just had the data to understand where we are on these two things, I can make a call, right? But nope, I got to wait till 10 because that's when we can all meet. I think
Right.
that's sort of a hijacking of our autonomy,
Yeah.
and more importantly, it's a hijacking of our impact, right? Our calendar controls what we can impact, as opposed to we make decision control over what we can impact.
Yeah, I feel like it could be a blessing and a curse having all of the these tools with data and everything, so you can see where your team's been and how you can jump in at the time that you come online or whatever. Adriana, Mural has a lot of, we were talking about this visual, digital whiteboard situation. I imagine, this is just occurring to me, but I imagine that you would have to encourage your staff to really be good about like keeping a diary, right? Like everything they do, they kind of have to update. I don't know if has that been a challenge that you've come across at all?
We don't necessarily keep a diary in terms of everything that they do, they need to update. And you're hearing a little bit of that, right? I think there was an article that came out a couple weeks ago around this obsession with productivity, where workers feel like they're being more productive, but managers feel like they're not being as productive. So there's a disconnect there happening somewhere. And really is that I think managers were taught in all these years where they were going into the office to manage by just walking around and seeing what people were doing. But you really need to manage by output or by outcome now.
Yeah.
So I think we're trying to replicate what we saw in the office. Is like, are you responding to Slack right away? People are putting things on their computer so they can see if you're actually scrolling. Nobody wants that, right? The name of the game nowadays is really flexibility. And if you set clear goals, clear direction, you have time to kind of check and make sure that things are going well. Ultimately, what matters is the output and the outcome. And with younger people, you want to check a little bit more often, but you don't want to be micromanaging how they're doing their work, because autonomy really is the thing that is making people be very excited about the work that they're doing. So it's really just, what I love about the pandemic, there were so many bad things about it, but one of the things is it's just called into question all of these management practices that we had that were outdated, and now they're making you rethink what is the thing that actually motivates people? How do I keep people aligned? How do I keep them inspired? And they're very different from what we thought they were.
Just want to remind the audience that in about 10 minutes or so, we're going to start taking audience questions. So I think there's a QR code somewhere around here that you can scan and or maybe on your back, I don't know. But there's a QR code. You can scan it and you can ask some questions and I will try to get to them. Now, wondering how this affects, in terms of hiring, in terms of being competitive. I'm curious who has the power. Is it the companies or is it the workers? Because there's these same pay everywhere schemes that are happening. So I'm wondering, do companies need to do those to remain competitive, or can they get away with paying people less money if they live in a small town?
We haven't said if you live in this zip code, you make less than if you live in that zip code. And part because who knows which zip code anybody lives in right now. Last month they lived in this one and now they're in that one, right? Just so if everybody is remote, it also means everybody is mobile and free to move what suits them, right? So we have people who had kids this year and like, wow, it became super helpful for them to move closer to one of the partner's parents. And they moved there for the year, but actually now they want to go back over here, right? Like this sort of idea that people are stationary, that's out the window, right?
Right.
Then if they're not stationary, how exactly are we going to effectively manage, and how will we ever rationalize a plan that says, no, because you're moving, you get paid this much. Because you're stationary and you're here, you get paid this much, right?
Right.
Just, especially if you're a small company, I think the adjudicating it, making it fair, explaining it, actually managing and administrating it, I think are way more pain, way more squeeze than any juice you're going to get out of that. And the downside of doing it poorly is huge.
I think where it becomes interesting too is when you have a global workforce and you start seeing too, it's just, you have the United States, you have England, Switzerland, places that are traditionally more expensive costs of living, and then you might have other countries that are traditionally lower costs of living. And now we're starting to see American companies, for example, hiring people in cheaper labor locations at the same salaries as American salaries. And it's creating this interesting disruption right now where the local companies can't keep up with the American companies. So it's just, I feel like right now we're just going through all of these experimentations where we're just going to figure out where things land. But it is a difficult decision for companies to decide what they're going to do and whether they're going to pay by location or just pay equally, because I can see both sides of the equation for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And Allison, we talked about the downsides and the upsides of, paying, or not necessarily paying people who live abroad, but we all have this dream of being the digital nomad and going to Bali and working from there, and it's great until you realize that the time zone is horrible, right? So, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think COVID was so interesting that there were all these big problems like pay in different countries and locations that became one of the biggest topics. Another is thinking about hiring people globally in a way that we'd never had opportunity to before. And there's these amazing companies now that enable you to hire people in all these different places. And it's really great. But I think one thing not to underestimate is the complexity of adding each additional layer, whether it's another state or another country. Because if you're hiring one person in a country, that may seem okay, but over time that person may feel like they don't have the same access to things as people in other countries, or there can also be tax implications for both the individuals and the companies, and it can be complicated to administer as well from an operational perspective, even if you're working with different companies that do support it. I think the HR admin side shouldn't be underestimated as you're thinking through. Another is time zones. So it may be okay. I think time zones may be even more important than the particular country or location, because it's much more difficult to work with teams that are on the other side of the world if you only have maybe 1 or 2 hours of overlapping, because there's only a very tight window that you can engage. And while the goal is to minimize meetings, they still happen, and the employees in another country may feel not included if they're not able to make the all hands or it's at a weird time for them. So I think be very intentional about time zones and how you're even setting up your org structure so that people feel like they can work with people in similar time zones and things like that.
Yeah, what companies do you think could, get away with this kind of, be completely remote everywhere? Like do you have to be a certain size, a certain caliber? Like is it, the Spotifys and the Airbnbs and the Shopifys that can get away with it? Or can smaller, earlier stage startups also try for it?
Yeah, I think there's examples now of companies of all different sizes that have done it. I think, to me, it seems like the default now is you start virtual, and then if there's need over time, maybe add office space, or they'll start working in a WeWork and then get a conference room, and then if they outgrow that, they may add office space, as opposed to the default, I think, before was even if you have a couple people, you may get an office in person and work there 5 days a week, and now it may be, we'll work together 2 days a week. I think what's interesting is to look now at the companies that started virtual when it wasn't really the popular cool thing to do. Like GitLab is famous for this, and they went public. So I think they're one of the first big public companies that had this as a model. I think WordPress was another one, Automatic, that have been incredibly successful. But you can look back and see they were very intentional about how they did it from the beginning. At GitLab, everything is written down in their public handbook that everyone can read, and they sort of had to build the DNA of the company differently from the beginning.
Yeah.
I think you have to do it by design,
Yeah.
right? Don't let it happen to you. Decide which the model is, and then build for the model,
Right.
right? As opposed to make a choice that's based on who you hired this week and they want to be remote, so okay, that's that. And then next thing you know, we were a whole big remote team. It's like, no, if we're going to be remote, these things need to be true. These things need to be in place. We have to be more mindful about these things. We don't have to worry about those things, right? Just do it by design.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, one thing that we had just actually talked about backstage was how difficult, this is a little gear switch, but how difficult it is to be immersive, to do immersive learning when you're in a Zoom call. It just doesn't, it's harder to probably onboard, it's harder to, sometimes you just need to like sit in a room and do the thing and learn from each other. Otherwise you can be, you know, separated in your own little hovels. But so what are you finding there?
Biggest learning for us over the last 3 years was that it's very difficult to really build expertise in a domain or a subject through Zoom learnings. And of course, Zoom learnings are by drip because who could take more than an hour of it at a time, right? But the way we did enablement for sales team or for on-ramping engineers or for our services team or success team before the pandemic was we do immersion like 3 days deep. It'd be, here's some domain expertise, some concepts, and then now go out in groups of 3 and practice it, like try it on, chew it around, right? And so people would step out, go into small groups, go outside, do their thing, like practice and iterate with each other. And 2 things happened out of that, right? The practice and iteration were real instead of fake, so they actually got better, right? And then of course they built some social fabric between them and trust and right that they could use later. But we tried to recreate that especially in 2020 and 2021 in Zoom. It's abject failure. And so we decided like enough of that. We're actually going to bring everybody together. We're going to bring the whole company together. First one we called Homecoming was awesome. Like, wow, everybody's cup filled up. Like, oh, people, they're so good. And just the enablement that went around that's like you're learning stuff together during the day, you're trying stuff, you're like pushing what you understand, you're like building how much more you know, and then do the celebration, the parties, and play at night. It's literally the difference between taking the elevator to the 48th floor or taking the stairs to the 48th floor. Like you just get there so much faster. And after one of those, we said, okay, that's the new formula. Like, I don't care whether CFO don't like that. That's got to be in the budget. And we can't afford not to bring people together. And right now, that's all we use our office space for is enablement. So my CS team and services team right now are in our office in Redwood City. They've been there a couple of days. They're doing this whole immersion thing. And we're advancing the playbook, and this is how we advance the playbook. We bring everybody together to do immersion learning, right?
Right, well, you know, speaking of immersion, so Meta, I almost said Facebook. Meta is coming out next week, I think, with the new Quest Pro VR headset. And one of the things they're advertising it for is for virtual offices, and they say that the avatars will have like more realistic facial expressions. So, thoughts?
That is not what we need right now.
We've tested out some of these, and maybe it's because the technology is not quite there, but we tested some of our offsites in a virtual world where we had a place that one had a stage for dancing, one had a stage for just conversation. It was kind of cool because you would move your avatar, and the closer you would get to other people's avatars, you could hear their voices louder and you could join conversations. But I think what happened is that it's not real.
Right.
Right? And there is something about that experience that's just much more 3D. And that's what I mean. It's like maybe the technology is not quite there yet. I would get bored after about 5 or 10 minutes. And I started seeing the drop off as well from people. So who knows, right? I don't know where things are going to go. I don't want to poo-poo it because who knows where things will go. But I don't think we're quite there yet. That said, kind of going back to this, having people learning, yes, I don't have to convince my CFO so much to get people together, but you don't always have the luxury to do it, especially today, right, where the markets are kind of crazy. One of the things that we have found at Mural that's really helpful is we call it the thoughtful host. So it's really having a facilitator, somebody who is a professional facilitator, have these meetings and architect them and run them. It just makes a whole world of a difference because you have somebody there whose job is really to make sure that you're feeling included, that you're feeling like you don't want to check your email, you don't want to check that Slack because you're just having so much fun and you're getting so engaged. So that's one thing that I do recommend out of companies, right? It's just like if you can't manage to be in person and you actually need to get somebody's attention, it's that facilitator, that thoughtful host in something that's designed and architected can go a really, really long way.
Is that a job now? Are people doing this? Is that like a
Oh my gosh,
contractor
yes,
gig?
incredibly so.
It's like the new wedding planners.
You know, a
Amazing.
super easy hack to make an in-person enablement in a meeting, like change it up, is no classroom seating. Like none. No rows of tables with chairs, like couches, coffee tables in front of it, like dining tables, like just mix the whole physical thing up,
Yeah.
right?
And casual.
Like where there's like how we're sitting, but for a lot more people. And it changes the whole gig entirely. Like the classroom thing is like, okay. And then the couch thing is like, okay, I'm receptive. It's
Yeah,
just
you can
a
be more
different
yourself
vibe.
in that world.
It's not stuffy, right? It's not, the room is unstructured and the flow is just a little bit, but it's such an easy hack. And as soon as we did the hack the first time, like there will be no more classroom seating. It's nothing compared to the informality of like gathering as a group as opposed to the structured, and now thou shalt learn.
Now, I want to get to some of these audience questions. Alison, maybe you can hit the first one. What do you think about quiet quitting?
Super interesting. And I think we're in a new age where it's easier to hire people from everywhere, but it's also easier for them to switch jobs if they don't like it. So I think it's a new reality, and that's where we talked a lot about onboarding and figuring out the employee experience. But I think that's where companies just need to be really intentional about how they're engaging with employees all the way through and making sure it's this relationship that builds over time, and both the company and the employer are getting really fully out of it, so they're not incentivized as much to look at other opportunities, because I think it's something that, there's rumors of people working multiple jobs and things like that. I think it does open up all sorts of different possibilities that didn't exist before, but I think it's a new age where there's just different demands on both sides.
Yeah, I'm actually hearing that a lot of workers are starting up their new companies on the side because they have all this extra time, the 2 hours that you would have spent commuting. Okay, this one's for Deidre. How do you think about strategy decay and helping managers feel empowered, be expert translators of the strategy, and manage in a remote world?
Managers in the middle are not expert translators. They're terrible translators, and your engagement surveys tell you that already, right? I think it's important to have formality in the cadence of your business, right? We set long-range strategy in these intervals. We revisit it on these intervals. Your board meeting is probably part of that cadence or that cycle. And when we agree on what the long range is, we then define, okay, what part of the strategy we want to execute in the next quarter, and then use the same framework for every manager across the org, for them and their teams to agree on, okay, what's their contribution, what impact are they going to make in this quarter? One framework for articulating that, for defining it, aligning it, and measuring it. As opposed to what I think lots of us do or did in the past is, okay, each manager will figure that out. They will not.
Yeah.
Right? They will not. There's nobody here who thinks every manager we have is so ridiculously good. Such clear thinkers. They just really understand our strategy and where they're going to go. They don't. Probably you promoted them. They were individual contributors. Their first management job is at your company. Right. And then their first director job is at your company. Again, if you're not actually giving them a framework to help their team articulate the impact and the outcomes they're going to drive this quarter and how those contribute to the company, they're not using a framework. They're like probably not even that clear. Like, well, let's do stuff. Let's do a lot of activity. without the translation of that actually drives the company forward in these ways, right?
Yeah.
So provide the structure, provide the framework, expect everyone to use that. In the same way you expect them to live your values, expect them to use a common framework for how we align on the strategy we're driving and the impact we want to have.
Who would you entrust that building that framework to? This is top down, I assume, obviously, but like who often, what you hear from startups is a lot of the CEOs or the founders. A lot of founders end up being CEOs, and they're not really management people. They're just brainy geniuses who have a great idea.
Yeah.
So who do you?
And there's a bunch of ways, I think, to go about it, and whatever framework you come up with, revisit that framework every year too, because it probably needs to evolve. And the idea is to have one framework, not 9 or 19 or 90, but think of it as evolving as your company changes size and scale, right? I think lots of teams talk about OKRs. It is a framework for this purpose, and there are a ton of, literally you can go get certified to be an OKR coach, so you're a pro in the framework, right? And actually bring that back into your company, like, oh, here's how we should structure it. This is what works. I learned from 10 peer companies, and this framework will work here. Doesn't matter so much what the framework is. It matters actually a bit more that it's the same one across the company. If you have 9 frameworks for mapping strategy, you actually have none.
Yeah, I think the frameworks is key. Mural is a digital whiteboard, but actually we decided to be more than that because we found that in meetings you could just give people a tool, and if people don't have the same framework or the same way of doing things, it just doesn't go anywhere. So earlier in the year we acquired a company called Luma that's all about these frameworks, and we have noticed too that both internally as well as with our customers, once they take on the same language and they say, okay, if we're gonna sit down and we're gonna do ideation, this is the methodology that we're gonna use. We're gonna sit down and we're gonna do prioritization. This is the methodology we're gonna use. Cluster mapping, all these kind of different things. Not only does it give you the same language, but it just makes it a lot easier and everybody's on the same page. So it is so important. I completely agree with you. Yeah, it's a completely accelerator. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
A bit of a gear switch. Do you offer alternative options for introverts or generally people that don't like large gatherings and typically are not willing to come to meetings?
I think the gathering doesn't actually, we did the full company thing, and we try to do that every year, and then obviously then there's the quiet people. And what we switched to our current thinking is the more effective thing is you bring 1 or 2 teams together where the relevance of the information is super high for everybody.
Right.
And the stakes for being there are super high for every participant. And they're also super common. So the people they're coming together with, 100% of the people they're coming together with are people they're already indexed with. As opposed to 20% of the people in the gathering are who they index with, and then the other 80 are like, I don't know who that is, I've never seen that guy, I don't know what he does here, right? Or like, I feel super left out because that's clearly where the cool kids are and I'm over here, right? So actually reducing the footprint of who's in the gathering, and it can be all eng or all engine product, or as I mentioned, their services and success team are together because their index is pretty high, but their trust was not. So everybody was a big stakeholder in being present there, as opposed to like neutral. It's gonna be an all hands, but I can watch that on Zoom. It doesn't matter if I go or don't go, right?
Right.
So instead of the all company thing, we found that the smaller and super relevant groupings were an easier path for people to rely on relationships and context they already had, which was a different level of comfort in the setting or in the session. Right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Well, I really wish I could get through a lot of these questions, but unfortunately we are out of time. Thank you all for joining. This has been really interesting and I hope enlightening for others. And thank you to the audience.
Thank you.